Hello, my name is Julie Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Identity-Defined Security Alliance, and I want to thank you for joining. Our webinar today is presented by IDSA member Thales, entitled Practical Steps You Can Take Today to Meet Authentication Requirements Specified in the Presidential Executive Order. By the end of this webinar, you will have a better understanding on how to address the multiple user authentication journeys in your organization and apply the appropriate level of authentication, taking into account authentication use cases, user profiles, security requirements, and regulatory constraints. So before we start, I want to point out a few of the logistics for today's webinar. We are recording today's discussion, so please make sure to share the link with your colleagues. You'll be able to submit questions through Q&A chat window, so if you have any as the discussion unfolds, please submit them. And lastly, the common question is, will you share the presentation slides? And the slides will be posted to this Bright Talk session after the webinar is completed. So before I turn it over to our presenter today, a quick commercial for the Identity-Defined Security Alliance. The IDSA is a nonprofit organization that facilitates community collaboration to help organizations reduce risk by providing education, best practices, and resources to implement identity-defined security. Our membership is comprised of leading identity and security vendors, such as Thales, in addition to our customer advisory board members, who provide guidance on our mission and represent the practitioner community. And all of our resources are freely available on our website, which is idsalliance.org. So now, let's get started. I'd like to introduce you to our presenter for today, Asaf Lerner. Asaf is the IAM market owner for Thales. He brings over 20 years of swimming in the high IAM seas, serving in different positions in the industry, from R&D management to PKI and authentication, product management, and various market-facing roles. He is in charge of the IAM solutions market for the Americas at Thales Cloud Protection and Licensing, formerly Gemalto SafeNet. Under his responsibility is creating market awareness of Thales's IAM solutions, enhancing market partnerships, and creating healthy channel work streams. Asaf, let's see your wonderful face, and welcome.
Wonderful.
I will turn it over to you from here.
Right, thank you so much, Julie, and thank you, IDSA, for having me and inviting me to speak. As you can probably see, I'm back in the office, in our beautiful Thales Austin-based office. Very thrilled to be here and speaking with you all. Today's presentation is about the executive order, right? And we'll speak about a little bit about what is the executive order exactly, and we'll focus on the authentication zero trust requirement within that executive order. We'll talk about how can we or organizations comply quickly, or what are those low-hanging fruits when we're trying to comply with the authentication zero trust requirement within the executive order. So without any further ado, I'll just turn off my camera and move on to the slide deck. Please, there will be a Q&A session at the end. Feel free, write those questions, and I hope I will be able to answer those. So let me just turn off the camera and share the slide deck. Okay, great. So again, executive order, and let's talk a little bit about that. Slides are moving. Let's see. Slides are not moving. Sorry about that. Okay, so on today's agenda, we will cover the executive order key points. What are the drivers for the executive order? We'll talk about the complexity and urgency that reflect in the executive order. We'll kind of zoom in into the authentication requirement and talk about reference architectures from NIST, and we'll talk about what exactly is identity-centric zero trust, and then some Q&A. Okay, so a quick recap. As you all heard, it was on the news, but for those of you who didn't really, were focusing battling ransomware, on May 12th, President Joe Biden signed an executive order titled the Executive Order to Improve the Nation's Cybersecurity. On the top of it, on the face of it, it's one of the most in-depth approaches of U.S. To the cybersecurity world ever. Practically is one of the longest executive orders ever issued, and it really reflects the importance that the U.S. government, the president, sees in giving an answer to the recent breaches that hit the U.S. And they see they recently compare those attacks on U.S. companies and other companies to terror attacks, so they have to treat it seriously. Therefore, it's maybe one of the most comprehensive plans how to deal with the cybersecurity status in the U.S. The target audience, because this is an executive order, is federal government agencies, because they are subject to executive orders, right? The president cannot really force other entities other than federal agencies, and it cannot really allocate budget. He can only prioritize budgets, but the broadness of this executive order talks not just about federal government agency, it talks also about the private sector. And it really refers to the private sectors or the vendors or the security expert out there in three verticals, I'd say. One is technical partnerships. We understand today that the government alone cannot really address all the security risks out there, right? They need help. They need the private sector. They need the commercial sector to chip in and help them fight all these attacks and mitigate the risk. So they refer to the private sectors, to all the players out there. You are our technical partners, right? So we came up with this cyber safety review board that will be compromised from government agencies and government leaders and private sector cybersecurity leaders. NIST held a workshop with both commercial and government cybersecurity experts. So really, the private sector is an integral part of this executive order. They really understand that it will be at the end of the day private companies that will implement those changes. And indirectly, one of the topics that this executive order refers to is the supply chain, right? I'll touch more on that later on, but for now, supply chain tax, and software development standards are to be defined, and they will impact private companies and will encourage them to improve the way they develop software and distribute them and sell. In terms of timetable, the executive order really define a very, I'd say, aggressive timelines to implement within 60 days, which I think we passed, right? Almost. The agency's heads will require to update the plan, right, of how are they going to move to the cloud or embrace more cloud technologies and develop a strategy to implement zero trust. And that's a huge change because the government acknowledged that the future of IT, the future of infrastructure is in the cloud. It recognized the fact that the cloud is in fact more secure because it's run by experts, right? No one can really run their own infrastructure. And it's 60 days in government timelines. It's very fast, so it's very aggressive. Within 180 days, agencies will be required to adopt multi-factor authentication and encryption for data in rest and in transit. Again, very aggressive timeline. 180 days to adopt multi-factor authentication and encryption for data in rest and in transit. So that is the quick recap. The main drivers for this executive order is the recent breaches. And you know, since I wrote this presentation, we encountered another huge supply chain attack on Kaseya, and the SolarWinds breach and the Microsoft Exchange vulnerability and the Colonial Pipeline breach. They really kind of pushed the administration to go and issue this executive order. And as I mentioned before, they really recognize the complexity. They understand that protecting the cyber world, right? Protecting the cyberspace is extremely complex. It's not something that an agency or even a big agency or a small agency can deal by their own. And they recognize the fact that a lot of the data was siloed, and we'll talk about it in a minute, but it's complex, and we have to do something now because the bad guys, so to say, are attacking our critical infrastructure. At the end of the day, that impacts the economy, that costs lives, that interferes within our normal way of doing things or normal life, which is exactly what a terror attack will do, right? Put fear in people's heart and interrupt their normal life. So these are the main drivers. Now, if we'll go and one second, Corey. Okay, if we go and we look at the key issues that this executive order addressed, so we'll see that first of all, we're talking about information sharing. Information sharing between agencies and CISA, information sharing between agencies and this private sector in order to allow them to respond and deal with those attacks. So we need to remove all the legal barriers and allow that information sharing, which is critical for attacks analysis and mitigation. Establish a cybersecurity safety review board. As I mentioned before, it will be complemented from government cybersecurity specialists and private sector. Improve investigative and remediation capabilities. Improve supply chain security. Again, the SolarWinds really hit the supply chain in its soft belly, and we need to come up with standards around software development and distribution to prevent those kind of attacks or mitigate them. Incident response playbook, we need to standardize, right? Standardize the response techniques between the different agencies and CISA and other bodies. So they will come up with a standardized playbook. And Monday's data encryption in transit, in rest. And the two last ones is Monday the use of multi-factor authentication and move to secure cloud environment and zero trust architecture. And this is what I'm going to cover from now on, right? So we can really spend hours talking about the different topics within this executive order. But today's topic, today's webinar will be all about multi-factor authentication. How do we securely move to the cloud and talk about zero trust architecture? So, authentication, let's kind of zoom in. What are the actual requirements in the executive order that talks about authentication? So let's talk about MFA. In section 3.d of the executive order, they require the implementation of multi-factor authentication within 180 days, and they want the head of the agencies to report every 60 days about the progress. The question is really what will happen after 180 days, right? Can we actually do it? Can we go and enforce multi-factor authentication within 180 days? And there are some questions left open, and we'll touch them again later on. what is multi-factor authentication, right? What are we supposed to protect? Because again, we all know that multi-factor authentication is a big world, and we need kind of dive into that. And if we look at the zero trust requirements, so section 3.82b of the executive order requires the adoption of cloud, right, and zero trust. Now, I really like that one. Why? Because everyone knows that when we are adopting the cloud, right, we are actually doing we are doing a shift or transition of responsibility, right? If in the past when we hosted on-prem data centers or on-premise applications, we as an organization, we were in charge of making sure that that data was available to our customers or users from anywhere, anytime, by any device. And that was our responsibility. And we kind of controlled who can access to it because it was on our premise. Now, when we move to the cloud, right, when we move to the cloud, what actually does it mean? It means that we shift the responsibility of making sure that that data is accessible to someone else, to the cloud provider. And they are doing a very good job at it, right? This is what we pay them for. So the cloud vendors are actually responsible for making sure that our data is accessible from anywhere, anytime, to anyone, from any device. Now, on the operational side, that's great because I just shifted a huge part of my burden, right, to the cloud vendor, and I'm paying them for that. But from the security side, it's oh my God, my data is all of a sudden accessible by anyone from anywhere, anytime, by any device, and we need to take care of that. Now, if we take into consideration that people are not using a single cloud provider or are not using a single cloud applications, but we're using hundreds or even thousands applications per organization, then we need to make sure that each and every of these applications are protected. And this is where zero trust comes in play, right? And this is what the executive order talks about. You need to adopt the cloud because we know that the cloud vendors, for the most of them, are doing a good job in maintaining our data accessible and keep it. But on the same sentence, not really on the same sentence, but a few sentences later, we talk about zero trust. So the executive order really bundles what it makes sense. If you're moving to the cloud, you have to go and adopt zero trust architecture. Right? Now, the executive order doesn't really talk about exactly what are the requirements for zero trust, but they do refer to NIST to issue guidelines about what is an acceptable zero trust approach, how this architecture should look like, and I'll touch on that later on. Now, if we look at these requirements, let's talk about what is missing, right? What I didn't find here. So, what types of data, right? They talk about you need to protect your data, you need to protect it with multi-factor authentication, you need to move your data to the cloud. What is data? What are the types of data? Are you talking about structured data, unstructured data that is, classified, what classification levels, like what do you want us to protect? And if I had to answer is everything, right? You need to protect cloud and on-prem using multi-factor authentication because it makes sense. It's the right thing to do. A lot of the attacks that were the motivation that created the motivation for the executive order are actually many of them could have been avoided if a proper multi-factor authentication were implemented. So, what is an acceptable multi-factor method, right? Is it a, does, the multi-factor authentication means FIPS 140-2 level 3? Or does it mean mobile app? Does it mean a text message? Like, what is an acceptable MFA method? And how does FedRAMP come into this picture in terms of we're moving to the cloud? Does it have does it have to be a FedRAMP accredited cloud, right? Cloud vendor, and does it deal with the bottlenecks today that cloud vendors are experiencing when they want to, FedRAMP their solutions? So I didn't see answer for that. And the big question of them all, is there a sack of coins behind this executive order? Who is going to budget this transformation and those changes? And I know that more to come on that. But these are things that are still missing, and we are looking for answers. I think that in time, we'll see the industry and agencies come up with good answers for those. Let's talk a little bit about implementation. So when we go and we want to start implementing the authentication requirement, the zero trust requirement, we need to kind of understand first or remember, why are we doing it? What is that zero trust? And if we go and we'll take a look at the NIST publication around identity-centric zero trust, I think we can find the answer there. But before we go there, let's kind of remember, zero trust 101, right? Why do we need zero trust? Why is it so important, right? So I know that a lot of people are talking about zero trust, and if you Google zero trust, find hundreds of vendors, everyone with a little bit of a different definition of zero trust. But the best definition I've heard so far is that zero trust is a mixed bag of technologies, right, that are aimed to serve as a business enabler, right? So, which means that in order to go and start implementing zero trust, we need to go back. If we're a commercial company, we have to go back to the business. If we're an agency, we have to go back to our core activities and think, what is that we're trying to do, right? And let's find the security technologies that will allow us to do that. So that's zero trust. It's a mixed bag of technologies that are there to enable business processes. Now, the most common definition of zero trust out there is what you see on the screen: is protect everywhere and trust nobody. And it really contradicts the way that a lot of organizations are doing their business right now. Because today we're really focusing a lot of these agencies and even companies today still hang on to their perimeter security or to the perimeter paradigm. They say, I will trust a person when he's in my perimeter. Now, again, we're talking about moving to the cloud. Once we move to the cloud, that perimeter is not relevant anymore. How do I go and move to the cloud and still allow users to use it safely, or still protect my data by verifying users' identity? So the answer is I would say, very simple. You find a new perimeter. And I'd say that identities today, and that's what we start talking about, are the new perimeter. We have to protect the identities as if we are, or we used to protect our perimeter, and then we can trust them in a way, or not trust them at all, and allow them to access our data. A lot of organizations are trying to solve this issue by verifying one's identity, allowing them in our perimeter, and then allowing them to access the cloud, going through cloud gateway, going through they tell the users first you have to authenticate to the VPN and then you gain access to the cloud. This thing has two major downsides. One, the VPN and the cloud gateway is a bottleneck, and it's also two is one point of failure, because if either one goes down, then we are out of service. So we need to treat the identities as the new perimeter. Now, how does this, like, why zero trust can improve security? Because as I mentioned, if on the left side of the screen, you see everything in my perimeter, right? And it's protected by this log pad that verifies the user identity. In a zero trust micro perimeter world, we go and we put locks or gateways near each data or near each application. And every time the user is trying to access each of these applications, we will verify their identity, right? Now, the question is, that's nice. What are those lock pads? It can be multi-factor authentication, right? Because multi-factor authentications, the target is to verify people's identities. So are we really expecting the user to go and authenticate themselves 5, 10, 20 times during the workday? No, because authentication is just part of it. You have to have single sign-on, and you have to have access policies enforced and defined in order to make this thing possible. So I would say that, if you want to go and find those low-hanging fruits, right, to implement the executive order, first you go and you put multi-factor authentication in front of every application, right? There are many solutions out there, cloud-based multi-factor authentication vendors that can allow you to put multi-factor authentication in front of your cloud apps, and in front of your on-prem apps, in front of your VPN, in front of your VDI, and even in front of your endpoints, right? So you first go and you turn on multi-factor authentication for everyone and everywhere. And if you do that, again, that's a low-hanging fruit, because most of us already federate our applications somewhere, right? And it's just a matter of switching it on. So you are going to be compliant. One will be compliant just by doing that. Now, the second thing is, once we do that, right, we have to make sure that we choose the right multi-factor authentication solution, because not all multi-factor authentication were created equal, right? We have to make sure that multi-factor authentication meets the user persona, meets the risk levels, and I'll speak more of that in a few slides. But first thing, turn on multi-factor. First thing, towards zero trust is to turn on multi-factor authentication and make sure we think of single sign-on. Now, if we look at the NIST model, how they see it, I know it's a little bit technical. Don't go dark on me now. But basically, what we see here is the NIST publication on zero trust architecture. So you see on the right-hand side, we have the enterprise resource, which represents our data. And every subject, every user that wants to access that data has to go through a system which we assume that it is untrusted, even if it's a corporate device, if it's a managed device, it doesn't matter, it's still untrusted. And it has to go through a policy enforcement point. Now, that policy enforcement point and the policy decision point, it's very much in the industry terms with a smart single sign-on engine, right? That looks at the subject, look at the identity of that subject, gathers a lot of information from all these different systems or different sensors, right? That help us make a decision whether to allow him, whether to trust him for that enterprise resource or not, right? So we have a policy engine with definitions, is that user, is that subject, is authorized to go and use that data or access their data under those circumstances. Right now, later, tomorrow, I don't know. But let's look at those parameters. So it can be a compliance issue. It can be information from our threat intelligence systems. It can be our identity management systems that just revoke their credentials. It can be our data access policies. It can be a lot of different parameters, right, or context bits that are taking into consideration when we are trying to enable or allow or disallow the user to access the data, right? So this is the identity-centric zero trust model by NIST. And I think that, you know, when we look back at, at the executive order, this is what they're talking about, right? Logging in to the VPN, allowing access to all the data that underneath that, that's not zero trust. Because once this user logged into the VPN, he's trusted. And then a malicious actor can walk into that VPN and be trusted and walk around the network, right? And that is exactly what we're trying to prevent. Now, there are other models, right, under the zero trust, which talks about network-centric zero trust, means I will not just microsegment data, we'll also microsegment networks, and we'll use other technologies like SD-WAN technologies and next generation firewalls in order to do that. The ideal way is to go and really mix them both, right? We'll have our SASE model and our identity-centric zero trust model combined, and that comes handy when we're trying to access cloud applications. All right, let's talk about again the low-hanging fruit, right? When we want, like, the first requirement on the executive order is start using multi-factor authentication. And I talked about, or I mentioned that not all multi-factor authentication solutions are created equal. And again, multi-factor authentication is the first step in your zero trust journey. So let's talk about some of those buzzwords around multi-factor authentication. So passwordless, what is passwordless? Passwordless is when we are verifying one's identity without using any textual inputs. It can be a password, it can be a one-time password, it can be PIN, it can be something, the guy's first cars model or any of this type of things. But we are talking about passwordless. If we will eliminate passwords, right, then no passwords will be able to be stolen, and we increased the technology. Common passwordless techniques are biometrics, mobile authenticators, push notifications, pattern-based authentication, and FIDO, right? So FIDO is a very unique and modernized passwordless technology because it elevates the security levels, right? We will use PKI in order, because the foundation of FIDO, at the end of the day, is PKI. We will use high assurance PKI technologies in a very convenient way. So FIDO is a great example of how you can utilize passwordless in order to elevate security. Adaptive authentication is a great example because we really will be looking at more context bits than just the user's input. It can be biometrics or a password or a PIN, but we will look at where he's coming from, what device he's coming from, his behaviors, time of the day, and more, a lot of different context bits that will help us to make a decision, going back to the zero trust model, to the decision engine. So going or starting to implement multi-factor authentication, we need to take into consideration that our users don't want to type anything. It is hard as it is for them to do the job, and we need to choose a very easy to use multi-factor authentication technology, right? Now, if, oh, sorry, one slide. If we'll go and compare some of those multi-factor authentication technologies, we'll see that some of them will provide you higher security, but lower convenience. And I think that, again, taking step one, applying multi-factor authentication, but it has to be done smartly. So before we go and we implement multi-factor authentication, we need to kind of look at user personas or user authentication journeys. How easy it is for our users to go and use a multi-factor authentication technology, right? What do we want our users' journeys to look like? It's very, very important because I've seen a lot of companies that, for example, mandated to users to use mobile applications while in the work environments they cannot use mobile, right? Or the other way around, where companies handed some hardware tokens or biometric devices where people are working with gloves or with face covering or in wet places. So we really need to look at not just the multi-factor authentication itself, but also to the authentication journey, which means how do I load token? How do I provision the token? How do what happens if I'm losing my token? How do I reprovision it? How do I use as little of that token as possible? Can I, in some extent, in some cases, can I use contextual-based authentication and not kind of, bother the user for re-authentication? So all these questions need to be answered before we choose our multi-factor authentication. And again, going back, it's part of our SSO engine, smart SSO, going to the zero trust model, making those decisions. How do I start? What's the first step? And this is my last slide for today. So a lot of people, a lot of companies are asking me, where do I start my zero trust journey? How do I start? So there are a few points that are worth mentioning under that aspect. So first of all, as I mentioned, the definition of zero trust is a mix of technologies that are there to serve as business enablers, right? So go talk with the business. If we're a security team, go talk with the business. Tell them what are you going to do in the next year and the next 2 years, and let me help find the technology, the cloud technology, and the security technologies that will allow us to do that. So that's first. And then let's learn where's our data, right? What are we trying to protect? Where's our data? Is it structured, unstructured, at the rest, on the move, in the cloud, on premise, on laptops, on endpoints, what endpoints? Where's my data? Let's make a list of all of my data repositories, applications that I need to protect. Let's categorize them, according to, do they support modernized federation technologies, right? Do I have access to those applications? Can I change the code? Can I federate them? And once I do that, I go and gate as many applications as I can with multi-factor authentication. So these are the first steps. And then we can start talking about single sign-on and smart single sign-on, contextual authentication, session management, and all those good things. But first, let's make sure that we know where's our data, right? What are my business needs? Where's my data? And get it with multi-factor authentication, and that's about it. So with that, let's take some questions.
Thanks, Asaf. That was great. So we have a couple of questions. that were submitted. I don't know if you want to stop sharing your screen. There we go. Enjoying the video again. Awesome. And for those that are on, if anyone has any questions, please submit them through the Q&A chat window and we'll get to them. But first off, so our organization wants to start the Zero Trust journey and use more MFA across more applications. However, in many cases, we can't use mobile-based authentication through a mobile app. What other user-friendly and cloud-oriented MFA methods?
Right, that's a very common question. Thanks for that. So how do I verify people's identity without using mobile-based authentication? So first of all, I can talk about a few technologies that are out there. First of all, we can go PKI, public key infrastructure, those smart cards, those USB tokens, right, that you carry around. We can talk about legacy hardware tokens, the ones with a button where you push and there's a one-time password on the screen. But we can also talk about FIDO devices, and we can talk about contextual devices, and even pattern-based one-time password generator that are sitting in your screen, and you will use a pattern to create a one-time password, just very similar to how you'll go and unlock an Android phone. So there are a number of different technologies that can help there, not using the mobile. I'd say that in most companies we see a mixed bag, right? We'll see some groups, some users will use their mobile and some not. Really, it depends on the environment and the security level. I'd say that even not all mobile authenticators were created equal. There are some that are FIPS certified, some are not. So it kind of needs a deeper dive, but in general, authentication, verifying one's identity without using a mobile can be hardware token, can be software OTP generators that sits on your client or sits on your browser. It can be FIDO.
Lots of good options. Great. Thanks for that question too. Let's see. I see many different MFA offerings from some cloud vendors. Are there any significant differences between them? Another good question.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yes. I see many different MFA offerings from some cloud vendors. Are there any significant differences between them?
Yes. So a lot of the cloud vendors will bundle, I'd say, multi-factor authentication with their services because it makes sense. We know that if you're moving your data into the cloud, it needs to be protected. And if it needs to be protected, so MFA is a must. I would say that usually those cloud vendors will do a very or a decent job of protecting cloud environment or their cloud environment or their cloud ecosystem. But if you want to use, at the end of the day, a single authenticator to protect both cloud, on-prem, endpoints, multi-cloud, you have to usually use a third-party identity provider in order to do that. And usually a cloud vendor is really good at providing cloud solutions. And a security vendor is very good at providing security solutions. So you need to look at the security aspects of things. And lastly, it's a good practice to have separation of duties. You don't put your identity management where you put your data, as if you don't put your encryption keys just near the encrypted data. So taking into consideration those things.
Got it. So separation for sure. Okay, let's see. Again, if you have any questions for us off, please enter them in the Q&A chat window. Looks like we have one more. How do I streamline user onboarding and MFA rollout?
Good question. So in the past, when organizations enrolled MFA, So they had to ship hardware, they had to send emails, click here in order to enroll, use your passwords. In today's world, most vendors out there will have what we called a user-initiated enrollment, which means that the enrollment of the token or the MFA will be on the login screen. So security teams will be able to set up a message that says, hey, Mr. User, from this moment on, your organization says that you have to use multi-factor authentication. If you don't have a token, click here to enroll one. In a few simple steps, the user is enabled. Now, when we talk about scale, when we need to enroll tokens for hundreds of thousands of users or tens of thousands of users, this is the way to go because it reduces the overhead on the IT teams and help desk teams. So I'd say that every solution out there that uses inline enrollment or user-initiated enrollment is the way to go when we're trying to, use multi-factor authentication everywhere.
Yep, that makes sense. What are your thoughts on a verify, don't store approach for validating a user?
Verify, don't, I'm not sure exactly what does that mean. But if I had to kind of read between the line, is where we want to verify one's identity without storing their personal identity.
That would be
That's
my interpretation too, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, in today's world, we're talking about taking it to the next step, which means we will bind between your true identity and your digital identity. How do we do that? It's a process called ID verification, know your customer type of technologies. And there are a lot of solutions out there that made it built into their authentication solution, that part, the identity verification part. And obviously a good solution will not save these credentials. These real life credentials on the solution. Other than that, I'm not really sure what that means.
Yeah, no, I that was my interpretation of that question as well. If we didn't get it quite right, then certainly put further clarification in the chat window. Actually, I have a couple of questions coming in from the audience. This is great. So the next one is, can you discuss what FIDO or FIDO devices are? So you mentioned FIDO previously, so it sounds like we need some clarification there.
Yes, for sure. Great question. So FIDO stands for Faced Identity Online. It's a consortium of companies that formed, I think, maybe a decade and a half ago in order to eliminate passwords. And although at the beginning it was directed to the consumer space, they told you buy this device or use our technology in order to eliminate your personal use passwords. In recent years, they released a new standard, FIDO 2.0, that was embraced by a lot of vendors out there, Microsoft, Google, Apple, and it became the de facto passwordless standard out there. So every time we talk about passwordless, most of the cases we'll talk about FIDO. Now FIDO comes in different forms or shapes. It can come in a smart card, a USB token, a mobile application. It's embedded into Windows 10, for example. Apple opened their NFC interface to allow FIDO communication. And FIDO is supported throughout all the major browsers out there. So today, when we talk about passwordless and we want to make sure we verify one's identity, then it will be probably a FIDO identity or a FIDO federation.
Great. Thanks for that explanation. So the next one, and maybe the last one, unless someone submits another question, is real specific to Microsoft 365. And I'll read it to you and see if you can provide an answer. So the question is the device registration service for Microsoft 365 the inability to leverage conditional access policy a known issue with regard to mobile device endpoint identity?
So that's a great question. I will not address specifically Microsoft. we can take that offline, but I will talk about device identities. When I talked about zero trust and contextual authentication, this is exactly what I talked about. Knowing the device that the user is logging from is crucially important in order to make a decision, right? I want to know if the device is a company issued device or it's his personal iPad or mobile phone if it's a BYOD device. Because, for example, if I know the device, right, if it's registered in Azure AD or somewhere else, and it properly registered, I can, for example, allow an SSO session, turn it on. Or if it's an unknown device, I will ask the user to authenticate or prove their identity, or block access completely if that's the risk level we're talking here about. So I really recommend device registration and browser registration and making sure I know the device, I know the browser, I have a mobile device, like a management service in place where I know its health status, not just talking about mobile devices, but laptops as well. Yeah, that's more or less it. Again, deeper dive into Microsoft's device registration, we can take it offline.
Great. Okay. Well, it looks like that's the end of our questions. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to thank you, the folks who submitted questions. Great questions. Appreciate that. And lastly, I want to thank Asaf for joining us today and for the great content on the presidential executive order. So with that, we'll call it a session, and everyone have a great day.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah.